The Galactic Military Academy had stood for 3,000 cycles as the premier institution for training the finest warriors the known universe had to offer. Its halls had echoed with the battle cries of legendary soldiers from 100 different species. Its training grounds had broken the weak and forged the strong into instruments of tactical perfection. And then humanity showed up and ruined everything. Commander Rektha of the Korthan Empire stood in the observation deck, all four of his eyes twitching in what his species called profound existential confusion, and what humans would probably call having a stroke. Below him, the infamous Crucible course stretched across 5 kilometers of carefully calibrated nightmare, gravitational anomalies, atmospheric pressure shifts, electromagnetic interference, and enough radiation to make a supernova jealous. 57 cadets from 17 different species lay scattered across the course like discarded action figures after a toddler's tantrum. Some were unconscious. Others were conscious, but wishing they weren't. A few were making sounds that the universal translator had given up trying to interpret, settling for unhelpful labels like despair vocalization and regret noises. And there, at the end of the course, standing at the finish line with his hands on his hips and looking around like someone waiting for a bus that was running late, was Cadet First Class David Mitchell. The human wasn't even breathing hard. "This is impossible," Rektha said, which was the 4th time he'd said it in the last hour, and he was starting to worry he sounded like a broken entertainment disc. His assistant, a young Felian named Zix, pulled up the biometric data with one of her 6 tentacles, while the others nervously braided themselves together. "Commander, according to these readings, the human's heart rate is elevated but stable. His core temperature is within normal parameters for his species. And," she paused, double-checking the numbers, as if hoping they'd change out of sheer politeness. "He appears to be... I don't know how to put this... fine?" "Fine," Rektha repeated flatly. "He's fine." "Yes, sir. Physically speaking, he's experiencing less stress than Cadet Thorvax, who collapsed 10 meters into the course." "Thorvax is a Gronian heavy worlder!" "His people evolved under gravity that would compress most species into organic pancakes." "I'm aware, sir." Down on the course, Mitchell had apparently gotten bored waiting and was now doing something that looked like small hopping movements while swinging his arms. According to the cultural database, this was called jumping jacks and was considered a warm-up exercise by humans. A warm-up. Rektha's leftmost eye developed a twitch that felt permanent. The thing about humanity, and the galaxy was still figuring this out, was that they came from what the initial survey teams had diplomatically termed a high-intensity developmental environment, and what everyone else called a death world that somehow got worse the more you learned about it. Earth had a gravity of 1.0, which seemed reasonable until you realized most spacefaring species had evolved under 0.6 to 0.8. Earth's atmospheric pressure was aggressively dense. Its magnetic field could probably be used as a weapon if humans ever figured out how to aim their planet. The native wildlife included apex predators that hunted for fun, and plants that had evolved chemical warfare to a degree that made military researchers weep with professional admiration. And Earth's weather? Earth's weather had opinions and the temperament of a drunken berserker with a personal vendetta against convenience. Humanity had looked at this planet and said, "Yeah, we'll build a civilization here." Then they'd spread to every continent, including the frozen nightmare at the bottom and the even worse frozen nightmare at the top. They'd looked at deserts that could cook an egg on a rock and said, "Sure, let's live there." They'd found rainforests with 100% humidity and mosquitoes the size of small aircraft and thought, "This seems nice." The galaxy had initially assumed humans were either the bravest species alive or the dumbest. Turns out they were somehow both, which was even more terrifying. "Cadet Mitchell!" Rektha's voice boomed across the training ground, amplified by the facility's speaker system. "You will report to the command center immediately." The human looked up, located the observation deck, and gave a casual wave before jogging, like he was in a recreational park, back across the course that had just hospitalized 57 of his classmates. 15 minutes later, he stood in Rektha's office, still not sweating nearly enough for someone who'd just completed the impossible. "Cadet," Rektha began, trying to sound authoritative rather than baffled. "Your performance today was irregular." Oh? Mitchell tilted his head, and Rekha noted, not for the first time, that humans had binocular predator vision that made direct eye contact feel like being sized up by something deciding if you were food. I thought I did okay. Bit easy, honestly. When's the real test? There it was. The statement that had launched 1,000 staff meetings and triggered no fewer than 4 emergency reviews of the curriculum. Easy? The word came out strangled. Cadet Mitchell, the Crucible course has a 73% failure rate. Elite soldiers from the Korthan shock troops require 3 attempts on average to complete it. You just walked through it like you were taking an afternoon stroll, and you're asking about the real test? Mitchell had the audacity to look embarrassed. Look, sir, I don't want to sound ungrateful or anything. I know you guys put a lot of work into this. But that gravity was only about 1.2 G, and I'm from Colorado, which is high altitude, so the oxygen levels here are actually pretty comfortable. And the radiation? He shrugged. I spent 3 summers as a solar panel installer. Pretty sure I've had worse exposure from standing on roofs all day. Rekha felt something in his brain break. It was probably important. You installed solar panels as a summer job? Needed money for university. Paid pretty well, actually. Mitchell smiled that friendly human smile that would have been charming if it didn't have so many teeth. Is this about me finishing first? Because I wasn't trying to show off or anything. I figured everyone else was pacing themselves for the advanced portions. There are no advanced portions. That was the entire course. A pause. A long pause where Mitchell's expression went through several complicated emotions before settling on what humans called awkward. Oh, he said finally. My bad? The emergency staff meeting was held in Conference Room 7, which had been specifically designed to accommodate the various atmospheric and gravitational requirements of a multi-species faculty. It was a technological marvel of environmental engineering. Right now it was full of very confused instructors. Perhaps we made an error in the humans' intake assessment, suggested Lieutenant Dalvor, the combat tactics instructor. He was a Vraxian, 8 feet of chitinous armor and warrior pride. He also hadn't stopped stress molting since the humans arrived, leaving flakes of exoskeleton everywhere. Maybe this Mitchell is actually a trained soldier who lied about his qualifications? Zix pulled up the file with a tentacle, displaying it on the central hologram. Negative. David Mitchell, 23 standard Earth years old. Previous education. Bachelor's degree in environmental science with a minor in history. Previous employment. Solar panel installation technician, camp counselor, bartender, and... She paused, confused. Something called a dungeon master? Is that a torture specialist? Dalvor leaned forward, suddenly interested. No, sir. According to the cultural database, it's someone who organizes recreational storytelling games. He's a storyteller. A recreational one, yes. Dalvor made a sound like grinding gravel. We're being outperformed by a recreational storyteller. Who also installs solar panels, Rekha added helpfully, because if he was having an existential crisis, everyone else could join him. Professor Yilainth, head of the xenobiology department and the station's resident expert on exotic species, raised one of her prismatic limbs thoughtfully. She was a Quilarian, a species that communicated partially through light refraction, and when she was thinking hard, she tended to sparkle. Right now, she was sparkling like a disco ball at a retirement party. I've been reviewing the baseline data we collected from humanity's initial contact protocols, she said in her melodious, chiming voice. And I think we've been fundamentally misunderstanding what humans are. They're Deathworlders, Dalvor said. That much is obvious. Yes, but we've been treating them like they're normal Deathworlders, species that evolved to survive harsh conditions. Humans aren't that. Humans evolved to thrive in conditions that should have killed them, and then specifically sought out worse conditions because they were bored. She pulled up Earth's historical data, and the room fell silent as everyone processed what they were seeing. This is Mount Everest, Yilainth explained, highlighting a geological feature that looked like the universe had gotten angry and stabbed the planet. The atmosphere at the peak contains approximately 1/3 the oxygen available at sea level. The temperature averages -40 degrees. The winds can reach 280 kilometers per hour. Humans call this the death zone. Okay, Dalvor said uncertainly. Over 4,000 humans have climbed it, for fun. Yillinth let that sink in. They pay enormous amounts of currency for the privilege. Some bring their offspring. And this isn't even their most dangerous recreational activity. They also jump off perfectly functional aircraft for entertainment, dive to depths that would crush most ships, and engage in something called free solo climbing, which involves ascending sheer rock faces without safety equipment because, and I quote, ropes are for wimps. The room was very quiet. They also, Yillinth continued, really getting into it now, have a documented phenomenon called runner's high, where their brains reward them with pleasure chemicals for pushing their bodies to the point of damage. They've literally evolved to enjoy suffering. That's horrifying, someone whispered. That's humanity. Meanwhile, David Mitchell was having a pretty good day, all things considered. Sure, the other cadets were giving him weird looks, weirder than usual anyway, and he'd apparently caused some kind of administrative incident by finishing the course. But that wasn't really his fault, was it? How was he supposed to know the big final exam wasn't just the warm-up for something harder? He found Lieutenant Kira Volz in the medical wing, checking on the cadets who'd collapsed. Kira was one of the other human recruits, a former wilderness EMT from Montana who'd joined the Galactic Military Academy because, in her words, I wanted to see if alien injuries were more interesting than hunters who shot themselves in the foot. Hey, David said, leaning against the doorframe. How's everyone doing? They'll live. Mostly exhaustion and environmental stress. A few cases of gravity-induced syncope. Kira was updating a medical tablet with the kind of casual efficiency that came from years of dealing with outdoorsmen who thought bare safety was a suggestion. Did you really finish the Crucible course? Yeah, I mean, it was just the Crucible course. She looked up, and there was something in her expression that was equal parts amusement and resignation. David, buddy, friend. You realize that course was supposed to be impossible for first-year cadets, right? It was? The last person to complete it on their first attempt was General Throknor of the Korthan Empire, and he's literally in the military history books. There's a statue of him. David felt his face heating up. Oh, I didn't know that. Yeah, I figured. Kira turned back to her patients. The other humans finished it too, by the way. We're causing quite the stir. All of us? Yep. Turns out when you evolve to think 1G is normal, 1.2G is just slightly annoying. Who knew? She paused. Actually, the entire galaxy apparently knew except us, because we're the weird ones. This was becoming a pattern, David reflected. Humanity had been in the galactic community for exactly 3 years, and they'd already developed a reputation for being aggressively competent at things that should be difficult, cheerfully oblivious to danger, and constantly asking, is that it? In situations where everyone else was begging for mercy. It was probably the Death World thing. Earth had some explaining to do. The second test came a week later, after the faculty had engaged in what the minutes diplomatically called extensive curricular revision, and what was actually a series of increasingly frantic arguments about what the hell they were supposed to do with students who'd accidentally lapped their entire curriculum before the first semester ended. We've designed a new course, Commander Rektha announced to the assembled human cadets. There were 37 of them, pulled from Earth's various militaries, emergency services, and, in one baffling case, professional extreme sports. They stood at attention with that peculiar human blend of discipline and barely suppressed chaos, like wolves who'd agreed to wear collars but hadn't quite committed to the concept of leashes. This course, Rektha continued, incorporates environments and challenges specifically calibrated to test human endurance thresholds. We've consulted your species' own military training programs and adapted the most demanding elements. David saw Kira and another recruit, Carlos Romano, former Coast Guard rescue swimmer, exchange glances. That was never a good sign. You'll be dropped in a simulated hostile environment with limited supplies and must survive for 72 hours while completing a series of objectives. The environment will include extreme temperature fluctuations, hostile fauna analogs, and atmospheric conditions that our models suggest will push even human physiology to its limits. Sir? One of the cadets raised a hand. It was James O'Brien, who'd been a smoke jumper before joining up. Literally someone whose job was to parachute into forest fires. Define extreme temperature fluctuations. Rektha checked his notes. Ranging from -30 to +50 degrees Celsius. A pause. That's it? O'Brien said. Yes, that's a temperature variance of 80 degrees. Okay, but that's like Montana to Arizona. That's just America. Rektha's eye twitch came back with a vengeance. The simulation dumped them in a holographic environment that was clearly trying its best to be intimidating. Dark, twisted vegetation. Strange howls in the distance. A sky that flickered between too bright and too dark, like the universe's worst nightclub. David checked his supplies. Basic survival kit, minimal rations, a standard-issue energy weapon set to training mode. Enough to survive, but not enough to be comfortable. Exactly like every camping trip his dad had ever planned. All right, he said, gathering the nearby cadets. First priority is shelter and water. Second is mapping the area and locating the objectives. Third is having fun with it? Romano suggested with a grin. I was going to say, not dying, but sure, let's go with yours. The thing about humans, and this was becoming a recurring theme, was that they'd been surviving hostile environments since before they invented proper tools. They'd walked out of Africa with nothing but pointy sticks and bad attitudes and conquered literally every biome on the planet. They'd looked at frozen tundra and said, I bet we could live there. They'd found deserts with no water for hundreds of miles and thought, challenge accepted. So when the simulation threw its first challenge at them, a pack of holographic predators that were supposed to scatter the team and force them into defensive positions, the humans looked at the creatures, looked at each other, and David swore he could hear the collective thought, we've dealt with worse. Because they had. Some of these recruits were from Australia, where everything was trying to kill you. Others were from Scandinavia, where winter was less a season and more an endurance test. One guy was from Florida, which was like Australia, but with more humidity and worse decision-making. The predators attacked. The humans formed a defensive circle, used their weapons efficiently, and dispatched the threat in approximately 4 minutes. That was the first wave, O'Brien noted, scanning the tree line. They'll send more. Good, Romano said, checking his weapon. I was worried this was going to be boring. Up in the observation room, Rektha watched 20 different biometric displays showing human cadets who were alert, coordinated, and, most disturbingly, seemed to be enjoying themselves. They're supposed to be panicking, he said weakly. They're human, Professor Yillenth replied, because apparently she'd become the resident expert on explaining why humans were like this. Panic is for species who didn't evolve while being chased by supersized cats with knife teeth. Humans respond to danger with a neurochemical cocktail that makes them sharper, faster, and apparently, more sarcastic. More sarcastic? Humor is a stress response for them. It's actually quite fascinating from a xenopsychological perspective. Down in the simulation, David's group had found a water source, established a base camp, and were now systematically working through the objectives with the kind of casual efficiency that suggested they'd done this before, which, of course, they had. Because humans had entire industries dedicated to paying money to survive in terrible conditions for entertainment. By hour 24, they'd completed half the objectives. By hour 48, they'd completed all of them and were actually helping other teams. By hour 72, they'd mapped the entire simulation zone, established multiple camps, and several cadets had started a competition to see who could identify the most edible plants in the holographic environment. When the simulation ended and they were extracted, David walked up to Commander Rektha with that same expression he'd had after the Crucible course, the one that suggested he was about to say something that would require another emergency staff meeting. Sir, David said, somehow making the word both respectful and questioning. That was the advanced course, right? Rektha stared at him. Rektha stared at him for a very long time. You know what? The commander finally said. Sure. Yes. That was the advanced course. Congratulations. You all passed. Cool. So when do we get to the stuff that's actually hard? The emergency staff meeting.